Hey guys, and welcome back to the Warwick F1 Show podcast. This is the 39th episode of the 2025 season, and we have come off the back of an Italian Grand Prix at the Monza circuit, which saw a surprise winner, one that I'm going to tell you from our predictions, none of us expected to come through, as Max Verstappen was the person who took the finish line first and won by a considerable margin. He won by a distance over the two McLarens by 19.2 seconds to be exact. He was joined on the podium, like I just mentioned, by the two McLarens in the order of Norris and Piastri, which meant that Norris has taken 3 points out of Piastri's substantial championship advantage. But that has not come without controversy, as there has been a little bit of team orders at play to allow Norris to finish second. We will get into all the controversy and the lowdown of that exact incident as we get later through the pod. It was generally, from outside of that, a pretty standard Grand Prix, nothing really out of the ordinary. So it's just time to kind of get into it. I'm your host, Anwar. I'm once again joined by my two co-hosts, Lucy and Daniel. So thank you both for coming on. I guess let's start where we always start. How good was this race on a scale of 1 to 10? I mentioned just now that it wasn't particularly anything outstanding. What would be a suitable rating for you, Daniel?
I'd give it probably about a 6, to be honest. Like you said, it wasn't a barnstormer from start to finish. There are a few talking points that we can get in, some juicier than others. But I'm not a huge fan of the fact that it was the shortest F1 race in history either. And it's quite ironic that it came in the week where Stefano Domenicali shared that god-awful take that younger fans want shorter races because highlights are popular, which doesn't really make much sense to me. But then again, I guess the stats don't lie. The opening 6 laps were great. We had a lot of passing and repassing, considering the fact that the top 4 finished in the same order that they qualified. And then, like I said, we got a big talking point, to say the least, later on, and I think your perception of that could probably warp your grade considerably, but mine's a 6 for now.
Yeah, I think if you have a certain agenda towards one of the two McLaren drivers, that rating will fluctuate massively. Lucy, where do you stand on it?
Yeah, I have to admit, for a race that felt like it generated a lot of debate, it didn't really feel like a lot happened. Like the first, kind of like Daniel said, the first 6 laps, first of all, 10, 15 minutes was very interesting. And I think like the commentators actually said that kind of there was more passing than they'd suspected. But then I don't know why this is. It may have been something to do with tyres. It may have been to do with airflow. It may have just been to do with strategy. It just got really normal. Like, considering that a lot of sometimes with races, I kind of hope that something happens, either that like the pit stops will be really interesting or that we'll get some sort of safety car and bunch the field back up. And genuinely, I was kind of surprised by considering how much I'd been liking the first 6-ish laps, how quickly I then turned around and basically was like, please God, let everyone in front have like really slow pit stops, and like all the midfielders have like 1 second pit stops, and then we get to see them fight, and it'll be so fun. Because it's interesting because I know that there's not usually a lot of overtaking around Monza, and so in terms of like a race as a spectacle, it's much more for the sort of almost the atmosphere and watching cars go fast down straights, that's what you get out of the race. But I don't know whether Zandvoort maybe set my expectations too high. I was sort of underwhelmed. I will admit we'll probably get onto the whole McLaren end of the race, whatever happened there, thing later, but that might have also left kind of a bitter taste, because it was sort of, for a controversy, it was the most anticlimactic controversy I think I've ever seen. Like, if you're going to do team orders, at least like do it properly. But
we'll get more into that later, because I think there's going to be a little bit of going back and forth with that for sure.
But yeah, sorry. Spoilers for later discussion. I mean, yeah, it's probably kind of, you could probably have guessed that we were going to talk about that at some point on this podcast. But I'd say in terms of how I'd rate it, it was a good race. I enjoyed watching it. At no point did I think I'm going to go and get up and do something else, which has been the case sometimes. But like a 5, it was okay. There were good moments. There were moments when I was kind of bored to tears. It was just there. It was there, and I'm glad I watched it, and I'm glad it was on. But I'm not gonna think, I must make sure I've recorded that so I can rewatch it again later.
We're not going to be looking back at the end of the season with this one and think, yes, this was a great race, and we're not going to have very fond memories of it at all. I personally would put it down to a 4. I look at it and think, yeah, that's probably below average, I'd say, in terms of entertainment. But that might be slightly warped by the big talking point of the kind of race, which we will get to promptly. Let's go through the race rundown before we actually start discussing the finer details. So Daniel, take it away.
Thank you. And just quickly, I think the reason that the first opening laps were quite frenetic was because the slower cars kind of got past the faster cars at the start, and then they kind of battled for about 6 laps. Norris got past Verstappen. Verstappen turned out to be faster, and Piastri got past... Leclerc got past Piastri, and Piastri turned out to be quicker, so that resulted in some back and forth. Okay, race rundown. Max Verstappen won the Italian Grand Prix, and his race pace caught everyone by surprise, so much so that Christian Horner himself started texting Martin Brundle about it in the middle of the race, presumably via WhatsApp, asking what he was wearing and sending selfies. Lando Norris finished second after McLaren's... Yeah, I knew you liked that one, Anwar. Regrettably or not, depending on which side of the fence you are, Lando Norris finished second after McLaren's one slow pit stop that they've done occurred at the worst possible moment to make the most controversy it possibly could, and consequently Piastri left Monza with a third place trophy, a grimace, and a 31 point lead in the championship. Thanks to Kimi Antonelli and Ferrari getting the Italian calamity, maybe a calamity or something, out of the way in Zandvoort before the home race. Leclerc had a contact-free run to 4th position on the road. George Russell in the post-race interview was quote-unquote speechless, which is about right, considering we hadn't seen or heard anything from him for all 73 minutes anyway, so that just kind of carried on. Lewis Hamilton arrived at Monza with a 5-place grid penalty, which made the race tough, because apparently half an hour before the Dutch Grand Prix and 20 laps of the Dutch Grand Prix weren't long enough to make a decision for an obvious penalty incident, but he finished 6th. The battle for 7th in the championship is really heating up. Albon was forced onto the grass by Antonelli at one point, but he managed to take the place from him anyway, on the track and in the standings too. And where did he finish? 7th. Bortoletto in 8th. He continues the trend of scoring after every Q3 appearance this year, while his teammate still hasn't even seen Q3 yet. He's beaten Hulk in every qualifying since Canada. On Sunday, Kimi Antonelli tripled the points he'd scored across all European races this year. That is to say, 1. Now he's on 3 because he finished 9th after some erratic driving penalised him. Isaac Hadjar suffered the first Q1 elimination of his career on Saturday and was convinced Sainz sabotaged his preparation lap on his way to the fast lap in quali. He opted for a pit lane start and scored anyway, playing the role of Moses when a certain incident took place. Next up in 11th and 12th was Sainz and Behrman. I mean, Behrman tried his best to DNF in his kind of clash with Sainz, both to serve justice for Hadjar's quali, and also so that Anwar's DNF prediction came in, but only one of those.
Get in!
No, but it didn't, Anwar. I hate to remind you, Behrman did not DNF, I'm afraid.
Yeah, crap.
Yeah.
You know what?
Aha! Finally,
Yeah.
Right, Lucy,
your
you can't
tactic
say
has
anything
been
about...
defeated.
No, you can. No, yeah, you can't say
My
anything about
qualifying,
predictions.
my qualifying prediction was very accurate.
It's gone off the road.
It has indeed. Daniel, get us back on track, please.
Okay, where was I? Behrman, Sainz and Behrman. Okay, Sonoda was in 13th. I mean, the most savage moment of the F1 TV broadcast must be the shot of Verstappen winning the race with Yuki Tsunoda in the foreground, about to get lapped. And just behind him was the Racing Bull of Liam Lawson, who decided to let a different rookie beef with Carlos Sainz this weekend. I'm sure he'll be back at it come FP1 in Baku. We saw Ocon in a nutshell on Sunday, really. He spends the whole drivers' parade chatting and laughing with Lance Stroll, and then he puts him in the dirt when it's time to race. Duality of the French. And for Alpine, the Renault engine deficit was clearly equivalent to having no front or rear wing at all, really, because Gasly and Colapinto finished low down in 16th and 17th in the doldrums. Lance Stroll was the last of the finishers after a 16-second pit stop, but sadly, British Racing Green rules could not be applied because Alonso sadly had a suspension failure during a brilliant battle with Bortoleto, so he was a DNF. And Hulkenberg, meanwhile, with a DNS, ensured that it was the most and third most experienced drivers who didn't finish, and not a rookie, actually. So there you go, Anwar. That's a subversion in the typical rule. Maybe donate money to Warwick F1 Society to stop rookie abuse or something, because it's clearly become a problem unnecessarily. That's your race rundown.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for a particularly entertaining race rundown. Yeah, we do hate rookies. Well, I hate a lot of rookies on this in our prediction segment, so maybe I should stop. No, I won't. Anyway, let's start going into the details. And I think the best place to start is kind of the surprise of the race here, in terms of Verstappen very clearly was the fastest driver over the course of that race, which is not something we've said for quite a while, because his Red Bull car hasn't really matched the ambition that Verstappen has showed, or the quality of display Verstappen has showed. He put it on pole on Saturday, which was a surprise to all of us in terms of pure pace. It wasn't really something that everyone expected. And then, despite losing the lead after lap 1, he was able to take it back from Lando Norris, who had surprisingly had a good start, and just sauntered away into the distance. Lucy, firstly, was that a surprise to you in terms of the pace difference between the McLaren and the Red Bull over the course of that race? Because we've seen him win races before, sure, but they were comfortably quicker, at least in his hands.
I mean, I kind of thought that that Red Bull's car might be looking sort of more competitive than it has been for a bit. Kind of after practice, can't remember if it's FP2 or FP3, because I can't remember when they made the changes, if it was overnight or kind of at lunchtime. But when they basically just seemed to sort of take like a chainsaw to Verstappen's rear wing and sort of shave half of it off to sort of really lower the downforce, which is obviously kind of what you want at Monza. I mean, in some senses, I shouldn't have been surprised as I was that Verstappen was up there being competitive, because the Red Bull has still been quite a good car down the straights. It's kind of almost the opposite to the Mercedes, where the Mercedes is just got no straight line speed, but in corners it's pretty good, and the Red Bull hates corners but is great in a straight line. And so therefore I shouldn't really have been surprised that Monza sort of favoured the Red Bull layout. What I was surprised with, though, I know that some of the 19-second lead that Verstappen ended up winning by was something to somehow strategy-based, because before the pit stops it was like 6 seconds. But I was surprised that he kind of was able to maintain, because 6 seconds is still a big gap. I was surprised that he was able to maintain a big gap, because I wasn't surprised he was competitive, but I was surprised that it basically never felt like the McLarens were challenging him for the win. And maybe that was also because I assumed that they'd be fighting each other instead of fighting him. But still, I was surprised by the fact that kind of his win from pole never looked in doubt. Like, it didn't even feel like, oh, but if second place does this crazy strategy, this was no scenario like last year where I thought that, if like how last year Leclerc just did one stop and then won, even though kind of Piastri had been leading the race. This, I thought, even if somebody tries a weird outlandish strategy, Verstappen's still probably going to win this. I wasn't surprised that he won, but I was surprised with how comfortable it looked.
Daniel, do you kind of how about you in terms of the Verstappen pace? Was that something that was within reasonable expectation in your eyes?
Expectation coming into the weekend, absolutely not. As you can see in our predictions, we certainly did not have this one on the cards. But I think, like Lucy said, there was some strategy involved in kind of flattering the 19-second advantage. It should have only been maybe 10, because the McLarens were on a really suboptimal strategy, waiting for a safety car or just a lap where they could fit the softs without them kind of blowing up by the end of the race. So from that side, maybe the gap should have been a bit smaller than it was, but at the same time, they earned it. Verstappen himself worked hard from Friday into Saturday. He kind of pushed the setup in an extreme direction, which helped. But Red Bull have been strong on low downforce all year, really. You look at Japan, they had low downforce. No one could overtake him, but no one could overtake full stop in Japan. Saudi, Red Bull were really strong with Verstappen. Silverstone quali and probably the race if it were dry. And conversely, Spa for about a day in the sprint before adding downforce because they expected rain. By that logic, maybe they'll be strong in Baku, but particularly Las Vegas too. So I think it's looking up for Red Bull in terms of they clearly understand at least what to do in certain types of tracks, and hopefully they can kind of apply that knowledge to different types of circuits and their characteristics, not just high-speed corners, straight lines where they are obviously strong, but take that learning elsewhere. It did kind of feel like a callback to 2023, didn't it? Verstappen winning by about 20 seconds, but also commenting on the other race events at the same time. So, really strong weekend. Clearly only applies to Italian races, though. Max Verstappen's wins. So maybe it's something about the Italian air just kind of invigorates him. Maybe it's the pasta is peak performance fuel for Verstappen, maybe.
Just those aromas just get him going. It's like pre-workout. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a surprise to me. I think the fact that he won in it, like, obviously it's slightly warped because of the strategy, but I think Verstappen might have had more pace in the bag. He might have, I think you see that a lot. If you are leading the race, you probably take your foot off the pedal, but like you do manage the pace a bit and keep stuff in reserve just in case. I think that was impressive, and I think he was faultless all weekend. The lap in qualifying was very, very good. He did lose the lead at turn 1, but he made that move back on Norris pretty quickly. So it just seemed like a very good recipe for success. And if I'm Red Bull, I'm looking at other tracks going forward, maybe a Baku that might suit them. I think Mexico's got a couple of straights, maybe altitude changes things, but I think that it's probably it looks up, and there's probably a bit of hope for them in terms of not salvaging a season, but having a few good results here and there, because it was looking a little bit dire for a bit. The McLarens weren't the invincible car that we've come to see, Lucy. Do you reckon that's setup related, or do you think it's just the makeup of the car that doesn't like certain circuits? Because we saw that in Canada, for example, they lost a bit of competitiveness. Is there any type of relationship or trend you can identify between those two?
There's nothing where I can immediately think that there is some correlation between a particular type of circuit and where McLaren are less strong, although, to be honest, that is probably because I haven't done a massive sort of in-depth comparison of all the circuits where effectively they've not won so far this year. But I think an interesting thing to note is that it's not actually that McLaren have seemed to have any particular weakness. It's that the circuits have just favoured the other cars which are previously a bit hampered. So in the Italian one, so here in Imola and also Japan, although that was a little more dependent on a very good quali and then just not being able to overtake, that favoured the Red Bull. And Mercedes were favoured in Canada. I think we maybe had said maybe because of the temperatures, they have massive tyre overheating issues. And if it's freezing cold, it turns out that your tyres don't overheat. So in that case, it's maybe less of a problem with the McLaren, and maybe an indication that kind of the reason why no one's fighting with McLaren is because a lot of the other teams have some sort of, to get all sort of Greek tragedy on it, some sort of like fatal flaw, be it overheating, be it corner performance, be it straight line speed or downforce or whatever it is. And so the McLarens seem less dominant when we come to circuits where the main flaws for other teams just don't need to be accounted for. They're not such big problems. And then we look at that and say, oh, the McLaren seems less dominant here, but it's not actually necessarily that the McLarens got worse. Like compared to, say, for example, the Ferraris and the Mercedes, the McLaren was still very comfortable in second and third place. There was a bit at the beginning where Leclerc was fighting with Piastri, but that kind of died down quite quickly. Maybe that was in the middle. I can't remember what happened, what order this race happened in. It all feels like a lifetime ago. But that it was kind of felt like more this was a good race for Red Bull as opposed to necessarily a particularly weak one for McLaren. And I'd say that's probably been the case for the other ones that McLaren haven't won, or where it's been a bit closer, is that it's not necessarily been a bad weekend for them. It's just been a good weekend for someone else.
I think it's also really important to consider the factor of tyre wear here, because I think we did really well to get a two-stopper out of last year, or the majority of cars getting a two-stopper, because it is a really low degradation circuit. It's not very abrasive on the tyres. I mean, we saw Ocon did a 51-lap stint on the hards out of the 53-lap race distance. I mean, he only did 52 because he got lapped. But that just shows you the extent to which they can manage those tyres. And we know that one of McLaren's key strengths this year has been their tyre management, especially over the Red Bull, who tends to drop away at the end of the stint. But Max just seemed to be perfectly consistent in pulling away, really. So from that perspective, I think Lucy's right in that McLaren's advantage didn't seem so obvious, but it did play into the hands of a Red Bull who, it was kind of a perfect storm is what I'm trying to say. The track suited them. They nailed the setup perfectly, and it all culminated in a crushing win.
Crushing indeed. And I think if I'm Verstappen, I'm thinking, okay, how many more can I get, how many? Maybe that is the secret. You just get a chainsaw, cut your front wing, cut your rear wing, sorry, and then suddenly the car comes alive. I was
going to say, don't cut the front wing off. That
might not work.
Don't do that. Gabriel Bortoletto tried that last week. That's not a good strategy.
Yeah, I wouldn't advise. Any team to do that. But I think it's time we get into the kind of main talking point of this Grand Prix, and that was the swap between Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, which some have said is ridiculously unfair, and some have been fervent defenders of. It's time to see where we all stand on this matter. Just to describe what kind of happened, both McLarens were going on this longer first stint where they were trying to play for a safety car, I guess. Lando Norris was comfortably ahead of Oscar Piastri. When I say comfortable, probably 3 or 4 seconds around the gap. Well, that was kind of the deficit between the two. And he comes on the radio asking, he gets told that we're going to box this lap by his in-race engineer. And he responds with, are we not pitting Oscar first because of the threat of Leclerc behind, who actually was showing some decent pace and potentially was a threat to Oscar Piastri. And then McLaren agree with him, decide to bring Oscar Piastri in first. He has a brilliant pit stop, 1.9 seconds, in, out, boom. And then the next lap, Lando Norris comes in. And in that situation, when he came in, he got a horrible pit stop. It was, I believe, something around the 7-second mark. And because of the extended time in the pit stop, he was essentially undercut significantly by Oscar Piastri, who overtook him. Now, McLaren potentially maybe out of guilt of affecting Lando Norris in his championship aspirations, I guess, then ordered to swap the drivers on track. So it was Piastri second, Lando Norris third. It was swapped back to the positions they had prior to the pit stop phase. So Norris second, Piastri third. And this brought a pretty big furore on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, and all of that. discussing how this was the worst championship battle ever, and we would never see anything like it. Before we talk about our opinions, I want to do this. Daniel, can you tell me what McLaren's justification would be for swapping the cars back?
So I think the method to McLaren's madness is that they want to have the least possible influence in determining the driver's champion come the end of the year, except for providing the dominant car. And from that perspective, they're only intervening when the team makes a mistake that can be easily corrected. I mean, obviously, you look at Norris's DNF and Zandvoort, that cannot be easily corrected, so it was not. But Hungary last year was the team's mistake. They were running 1-2, so they corrected it. Piastri in Silverstone, however, the penalty that he got was his mistake. So they didn't swap back. It was slightly unfair, yes, but it was Oscar Piastri who caused that. In Hungary this year, the suboptimal strategy was made possible by Norris's great tyre management, despite Piastri leading. So Norris made that possible. And so the team kind of weren't responsible for Piastri failing, as it were. So no swap. And this slow pit stop was a team error, whilst Norris was trying to play the team game. And I think in that vein, there was kind of a feeling that he was done wrong by getting that second stop that Piastri would have had if Norris hadn't questioned and said, "Oh, shouldn't we pit the other car first?" So they gave him back the place from that perspective. So I think that's their kind of system, their policy when it comes to intervening with the drivers. But obviously, whether it's right or not is an entirely different matter.
Lucy, do you think this matter is complicated more so by the fact that McLaren are running essentially two number one drivers in their team? Two drivers who are ultimately very equally matched. Do you think this is this kind of occurrence has happened directly because of that type of thing, in terms of the fact that they have to try and keep two drivers happy? How much does that play a part in this type of decision?
Yeah, I think that kind of, because I was thinking about this, is that sort of this has kind of come about fundamentally because Norris and Piastri are fighting for the championship, but also this is not kind of a fight for the championship where it's kind of Norris wins 1 week while Piastri's in P10 and then next week it swaps. They're always also very near each other on track, which means that kind of things like this, things like double stacking, general strategy calls kind of end up as... They're not problems because McLaren seem to have a strategy, whatever we think of it, which I'm sure we'll get to, for dealing with it. And maybe it's working for them. I don't know. But this is kind of... They are interacting with each other a lot on track, even if it's not that they're fighting. And so this has kind of happened because basically McLaren kind of, it feels like going into each race, McLaren's never 100% sure what the dynamic's going to end up being between the two drivers. And that is because they're very equally matched, which means that kind of going into it, you might be able to say, like last week after Zandvoort, we might have said, and McLaren might also have been able to predict that Piastri would probably have a better weekend from starting on pole position and also having a car between him and Norris in the form of Verstappen. But kind of going into every race, McLaren doesn't really know which driver's going to be at threat from another team, which driver's going to end up in front, because they can't really tell who's going to have better tyre wear or have better race or make a key overtake at a good time. So some of it is probably also that they've got their two number one drivers thing, but they're also having to kind of define what exactly that means kind of mid-race and also communicate that to the drivers, which means that effectively, whereas teams that have kind of a number one, number two dynamic, which I'm also, I'll be the first to complain about that on some occasions. This is by no means me saying that all teams should have that and McLaren should pick one driver and stick with them. stick with him as their number one driver. I don't want that. It would be boring. But teams that kind of always have like Red Bull, for example, always have a Verstappen is the number one driver priority, don't have to kind of work out how to navigate multiple strategies, how to navigate pit stop times between the drivers, because they kind of know what the default is. There is a default. McLaren don't have a default, so they're having to communicate it to the drivers and also to us mid-race, which is probably why it sometimes feels a little bit messy, a little bit like things are being made up on the spot, which is probably because it kind of has to be. It's better in some ways. It's probably better that way than just deciding, like, whoever's ahead at the end of the first lap just sort of gets default priority for the rest of the race or something like that. They kind of they're having to think as kind of, they're working with changing scenarios, basically, is what I'm trying to say in too many words.
Yeah, I mean, what you said is absolutely right in terms of other teams have a pre-existing kind of strategy of, okay, we're going to do this in this case for this driver who is our number one. They don't have that, and it's purely dependent on how the race goes, right? I think it's time to ask the question, Daniel, how should have McLaren played this in your eyes?
So I don't have an issue with the swap itself. And that is purely based on the presupposition that before the race, it was considered as an outcome. The issue is, as Lucy says, this is motorsport, and there are millions of different outcomes or eventualities or possibilities that could unfold during the race. So it's impossible to invent scenarios and solutions for every single one of them. And as a result, they are going to have to make them up on the spot. And I think that's what they did. I think McLaren, unfortunately, really contradicted themselves in Monza. I mean, you can talk about opening a can of worms. What if they do this in the last race of the championship? But I think the worst problem is that Piastri didn't understand why they were doing it. So he comes over the radio and he says, I thought we agreed that a slow pit stop was a part of racing, after he was asked to let Norris through, indicating that McLaren do have a sort of agreement that a lot of what happens on track is up to the drivers and not the team to sort out. And slow pit stops probably fell under this bracket of things that just kind of happen and they have to overcome. And in the post-race press conference, Piastri basically said as much. He said they had covered many eventualities together. And he said in the same press conference that radio message that I just mentioned told you what you needed to know. He wasn't expecting the request to swap, which means that in that race debrief or in the papaya rules meeting that they had, either Piastri has misunderstood those rules, which is unlikely, I think, or McLaren went against their own already convoluted rules of engagement to enforce the swap simply because they were still running side by side on the track. For example, maybe they thought a slow pit stop would mean they lose a position to a different team, and so reswapping the positions would be really difficult, but that wasn't the case because they were still second and third, just in the wrong order. And if that's that seems to be what it's pointing to, and if that is the case, then that in itself is really unfair on Piastri. I think that's more unfair on Piastri than asking them to swap positions when they've already discussed it before the race, for example, because then they are just making it up as they go along. And in those circumstances, unconscious decisions can be made in terms of letting in factors that possibly don't belong in that situation. I definitely don't believe that McLaren have a bias for Lando Norris, and they do everything in their power to make it a balanced situation for both of their drivers and to give them equal footing. I'm sure Piastri's contract states that several times, with Mark Webber writing in all the small print. But at the same time, it's kind of hard to defend when things like this are happening. I think for McLaren, they just kind of need to either leave them to it or fix it up and stick to their guns in what they're doing, because they're coming under heavy criticism from every direction because we've never seen a championship really micromanaged like this before, and I think it's hurting. It's hurting probably the drivers, but also the spectacle. So that's my perspective on the whole thing. McLaren need to sort it out, basically.
Yeah, I do get the impression some of this needs to be figured out bit by them, because I think what you said is absolutely right in terms of if Piastri was surprised, he's not exactly an idiot, you know. If he was surprised, probably because they have gone against something or not included something in those discussions that they probably should have. I think, from my perspective, I think I can understand from the perspective of McLaren thinking, okay, we are completely at fault. We want this drivers' championship to be purely decided by them as drivers, and trying to take away as much of the kind of variability as possible. And that obviously affects the spectacle of us watching, and it kind of gives us a reason to say worst championship battle ever. But it's just, it was so messy. And like you mentioned, Daniel, it's a situation that has opened up a massive amount of worms in some way. What happens if we're close to the end of the championship? What happens if someone gets a drive-through penalty or a penalty for speeding in the pit lane or something like that? No, not necessarily speeding in the pit lane, but for an unsafe release, let's say. An unsafe release isn't something that's necessarily the fault of the drivers, it would be the fault of the team. Would the person who's benefited from this teammate having unsafe release have to slow down, for example, or give back 5 seconds? The standard that they set is very difficult to follow, especially in such a dynamic racing environment, right? So it's very tough. I think it's horrible as a watcher or as for an entertainment perspective, and it does put a dampener on how cutthroat this championship is going forward, in my eyes. Lucy, how about you? Are you in Daniel's camp here, or saying they've got problems here that they need to fix?
Yeah, I think thinking about it, I was kind of, when I first watched it, because I watched it like 20 minutes after it actually happened, and so I knew there was some kind of vague form of controversy, but I think I already said earlier, it was kind of the most anticlimactic controversy ever. And I was wondering why I was feeding that. And I think that's because usually if there's some controversy, it's either because you get the impression that a team has favoured one driver, which I don't think McLaren did either. I think what happened in Monza was the result of poor like planning, like poor kind of laying out sort of the terms of like engagement, as opposed to kind of intentional bias. Effectively, kind of, to put it bluntly, sort of ignorance, not malice. But this was not kind of, like Daniel's already brought up Mark Webber, this was not multi-21, and this was also not a controversy. The drivers did not drive into each other. There was no forcing each other off the track or anything like that. And it was because it felt kind of like a couple of things. Firstly, I remember we talked about this, I wasn't on the podcast, but there was talk about this last year when McLaren were in, obviously they won the constructors, but when they had Norris in the title fight with Verstappen, is that it was brought up that McLaren didn't really seem to know, kind of, they seemed quite surprised at the fact that they were in a title fight. Like, they didn't really know what to do with the fact, like, compared to teams like Red Bull or Mercedes, or even Ferrari with how incompetent they are. It felt like they kind of ended up in a title fight and then didn't really know how to plan around that.
And you know what? That makes sense as well. And that's not something that that's not something we should be really critical of McLaren of, because it's been ages since they have been in a title fight.
Yeah.
For example, you wouldn't expect Williams to really have the know-how to deal with a championship fight in the same vein, right?
Yeah. And last year that made perfect sense. But this year, and even this late on in the season, it's very clear that there's basically no one challenging them for the constructors or for the drivers. Bar sort of, I don't know, like I don't know what would have to happen for a McLaren driver to not win the World Drivers' Championship the Red Bull to sort of turn into an actual rocket ship, I think, and McLaren to just not show up for any of the last races. But McLaren will win the constructors and a McLaren driver will win the drivers. But it still feels like they sort of end up in these moments. And most of the time, their strategies are great. And some of that is governed by the drivers. You know, Norris in particular, I notice, is sort of very kind of hands-on with his strategy and making his own strategy calls. And that's very fun to see because, you know, then we get different strategies on different sides of the garage. But sometimes it feels like they end up in these moments where it still feels like they don't really know what to do. And so I think that's the thing, is that it feels kind of, it almost takes you out of there being a good championship battle, because it feels almost like something that would happen. Like I could imagine this happening to McLaren in 2023 when they were in sort of the midfield and Norris and Piastri were sort of fighting in the midfield. That it feels like something that would happen then. It doesn't feel like something that happens when you're leading the Constructors' Championship by like 200 points. And the other thing was that I was also going to say was that it's kind of, it just sort of, yeah, it feels kind of that they've tried to set out, kind of like Daniel said, they set out all these convoluted papaya rules and what counts as racing and what doesn't count as racing. And so effectively they are sort of micromanaging the championship, which is good in some senses. I think it's great that despite being in a title battle, I guess at least from what we see, the relationship between teammates has remained very strong, considering they both have long-term contracts. That will also be quite a priority for McLaren, is making sure they don't end up hating each other. And that's kind of what you want to see. But in a way, my annoyance is the fact that they're kind of micromanaging the championship with all these sort of swapping back positions and who's pitting first and all of that sort of stuff. But they're still almost trying to pretend that they're not. They're trying to pretend that this all that they've kind of got what McLaren decide has nothing to do with it. And they're trying to make it that. They're trying to make it so that it's whatever the race results show, it's just down to drivers and how the drivers perform and drivers and all of that, which is good. But they're kind of pretending that they've sort of, their decisions have nothing to do with it, but they do. And so then kind of when something like this happens, it makes you think a bit sort of, oh, I believe that you're trying to let the driver performance decide the championship, but I don't believe that you're just deciding to let the drivers race and to see what happens. It makes you think you're not really kind of letting this play out sort of in a natural way. You're sort of establishing more and more conditions for how this championship works, and that kind of, even though that probably happens every championship fight, you kind of don't really like to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's just like they back themselves into a corner with these papaya rules, and the fact that there seems to always be controversy around this. It's never been this complicated winning a championship with having two drivers who are similar level in the same car. It's never been this level of team involvement, and I guess from McLaren's perspective, this is them making sure that the 1% chance Verstappen does end up winning the championship somehow is reduced to next to zero. That's going to be their mentality. And also, like you mentioned about the fact that these two drivers have contracts, long-term contracts at the team. If you rock the boat at any point, you're going to risk losing a driver of a really high caliber to another team. And that's, from McLaren's perspective, will be worst nightmare type of situation. One thing I want to address is the notion that Piastri shouldn't have let him by, and Piastri should have just been selfish and forced him to make the overtake. Daniel, would that have been a good decision for Piastri to make?
I was just thinking about this. I was debating it in my head, and a lot of people say to be a world champion, you can't be a nice guy. That's like that kind of thing.
Nico Rosberg type of vibe, right?
I mean, yeah, exactly. And I think Toto Wolff quoted that Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton were assassins in their day, and that's kind of the cutthroat edge that it takes to be a world champion. But I think this year we are going to get a world champion who is a nice guy and is a real team player and will move over when the team asks them to, because both of them have done it so far. Maybe not, over the past 2 years, both of them have done it at some point. And from that perspective, I think it's important for them to do that, because as much as a Senna or a Schumacher or a Verstappen wouldn't move over for their teammate, I mean, we saw Verstappen didn't even do it for the 6th place in Brazil 2022 for Sergio Perez, which maybe was because of the Monaco crash, but I think it's also just not in Verstappen's DNA, because he feels like he's superior to all his teammates and he always deserves to be ahead. So I understand why that's kind of accepted, as you can't move over for your teammate if you want to be a world champion. But at the same time, Piastri raised a great point in his interviews and in the press conference. He's at McLaren for a really long time, and he doesn't want to be selfish, because these people are the ones who have delivered him a car that can win by 16 seconds in Bahrain, for example. And he wants to have as many chances at becoming world champion for the rest of his career as possible. And from that perspective, he needs to have the team on side. And when you have two competitive drivers in a team, like they do, like Mercedes did back in the day, when one of them rubs the other up the wrong way, for example, or rubs the other driver's mechanics or any of the senior management up the wrong way, it's going to hurt the team in terms of morale and consequently perhaps performance. So it is just an intelligent thing to do, to heed the orders of the team when they come, if they are fair and just, which I believe in this case they just were to a certain extent. Also, another thought, I wouldn't want to be the mechanic on the front left who ruined Norris' pit stop, because I'm sure he's come under a lot of fire and a lot of attention from the team.
I saw a guy on Twitter say that this guy deserves to be sacked.
So from that perspective as well, just to kind of put that...
put all that to bed, right? Is that ridiculous?
Exactly, yeah. I just think, no, Piastri was right to do what he did, I think, and he knows it. He's safe in the decision that he made. He said he won't regret it come the end of the year, so I think it's happy families in McLaren, it seems, as much as maybe they're alienating the fans, which wasn't their intention. They want to be nicey and kind of have happy personnel and drivers, but from their perspective, they're just going to do it their way.
I think they fully are committed to this idea, so I don't think they are really going to be considering the fan entertainment side of things. That, the fact that we want a fierce battle, I don't think that really enters their mindset. But I agree with you. The fact that people were saying Piastri, if Piastri was to just try and force a fight there, it puts him in a world of hurt going forward. Like, there might be like second thoughts of giving him certain strategies or stuff like that, and some type of maybe some angst in the team as well because of that. The fact that he's gone against team orders to do so, and he's not working for the team. It's all about him type of thing. You don't want to build those types of narratives in people's heads, because it will affect you. It will affect mechanics performance, team morale, and the rest of it, which do play massive factors. So I think that's very important that you did eventually listen to the team orders. I was going to say, I think that at the end of the day as well, in a way, it obviously kind of, there are many reasons. I was thinking about it, feel like Piastri ignoring team orders there would have kind of been like falling out with one of your mates right after you've just signed to like live with each other for like the next year, and you're going to have to deal with each other for another year. Piastri's got a contract with McLaren until 2028, so he can break team orders and then have to deal with sort of increasing awkwardness for the next 3 years, or he can lose 6 points overall, which is a close championship fight. No driver ever wants to lose any points. But Piastri does have a buffer now
he can think more long term, because the gap was 34 points and now it's 28, I think. I think I've got that right. May have got that slightly wrong. I'm trying to do maths in my head and my brain's not turning on. But
it's 31 now.
It's 31 now. How did I get that wrong? Anyway. Oh, because it's not a swing. It was okay, I've gotcha. Yeah. So he's lost 3 points in a championship fight that he's still leading by 31 points. Obviously, if this happens every race weekend, you can't just say, oh well, it doesn't matter to him, because every point matters in a championship, especially if, as we all want it to, it goes down to the wire. But he doesn't have to worry immediately. He can think about team dynamics. He can think about what he wants to prioritize and how he wants things to work. And as opposed to just having to think about this year and this year's title, and even just taking it one race at a time, he can think of the bigger picture, which means that he doesn't need to disobey team orders. He can, at least right now, comply with them and not lose out that much. It's not like the team were saying, like, oh, which I don't think is like, oh, Norris's car is having an engine failure. Can we put like this faulty part on your car so you take the DNF instead or something? This is it was 3 points at the end of the day, which, yeah, like I said, he wouldn't want, but also it could be worse.
Yeah, it definitely could have been worse. A 3-point swing in the grand scheme of things isn't a needle mover in any way. Let's move on to our prediction, and we'll talk about a few of the other narratives as we go along pretty briefly, because there wasn't much else to talk about outside of the Behrman-Sainz incident, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's move on to the prediction segment, because we want to start we talked about that for an extended period of time. I went first with my predictions last time. Daniel, do you want to start us off?
Of course, always happy to get these out the way. I'll do it quickly. Pole position, Leclerc. Nope. P1 for Norris, 1 point. P2 for Russell, not nearly, overestimated their performance. P3 for Verstappen, underestimated him too. No, underestimated him, overestimated Russell. P4 for Piastri, 1 point. P5 for Liam Lawson. That really didn't come through. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
Putting him there. That was my washed predictions for this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, not the greatest start. Lucy, can you kind of redeem us here?
This is a leading question. Pole position, I got spot on. I said Max Verstappen was going to be on pole, and he was. And so I went into Sunday riding high. All my predictions were going to come true. Admittedly, when I made these predictions last week, I had forgotten that Hamilton had a 5-place penalty that he carried over. So I immediately regretted this 5 minutes into free practice one when I was reminded of that fact. I said P1 Hamilton. This did not happen. He didn't DNF.
Who would have thought?
He didn't DNF. I have to take this more wins. I said P2 Leclerc. He ended up P4. So again, could have gone worse. I said Norris P3. He was not P3, but he was P2, so I do get a point for that, and I will be clinging to those points that I can get. Said Piastri P4. I get a point for him being P3. No, I didn't say Piastri P4, did I? I said Piastri P5. Spoilers for my P5. I get no points for that.
Yep.
Wrong. And I said that P4 was Carlos Sainz. He was not P4, he was P11 because he had an incident with someone else again. But Alex Albon did get points, so I am fine with that.
Let's talk about that the Sainz Behrman incident, because Behrman was punished with a 10-second penalty and 2 penalty points on his license, which meant that he is now on 10 penalty points, but out of the 12 kind of limit, which what gives you a race ban. What was our opinions on this very quickly?
To be honest, having had a look at most of Behrman's penalty points, they are kind of insane. Like, I understand him getting some penalty points But he's got 4 from that red flag crashing into pit lane wall in Silverstone, which was embarrassing. But like,
not
Max
4
Verstappen intentionally drove into George Russell and got 2. Like, I feel that the pit lane thing's more humiliating than 4 penalty points worthing. I think I could do that in like a normal car and probably not get 4 penalty points. I'm not going to test that. I haven't.
Don't. That's not advice, guys.
This is not advice. Don't do that. Just take my word for it. But no, that was kind of weird. But it does mean we have another addition to the list of 10-second penalty points that feel completely disproportional to each other. I mean, I personally think that it was because it's my running theory that Carlos Sainz, after the horrific mishap of last week's penalty, should have penalty immunity, where he's not allowed to receive any penalties from now until the end of the season as an apology. But no, that was unfair to Behrman, and a shame really, because he, with the penalty that Antonelli got, he might have even been on for points or something, or if not points, at least would have had a race unspoilt by 10-second penalties.
Yeah, it's another interesting steward decision. Daniel, are you on the same wavelength here?
Yes, another interesting stewarding decision from Derek Warwick, after whom this podcast is clearly named in his honour, and
Indeed.
His gang of, yes, obviously, and his gang of stewards. I think it was a racing incident. Honestly, I think they were both partly to blame. I mean, we've seen it time and time again. What Behrman did has resulted in contact. You can't just hang in there with a half-hearted attempt at holding the corner with your front axle, because you probably will crash with the car closing the door from the outside. However, having said that, it did happen 2 other times, I think, in the same race, and there was no contact. Norris dangled in the front end when Verstappen overtook him for the final time, I think, and Leclerc did it too when Piastri overtook him. So, from that perspective, it requires a kind of compliance from the other car as well, but Sainz just doesn't want to comply these days. He doesn't seem to be able to read the other car's language very well. And that's kind of why he gets into so many scraps. You think of Leclerc and Piastri, they have incredible car proprioception, to use a psychology term, kind of awareness of their presence and their kind of movement. We haven't even talked about that stunning overtake around the outside of Lesmo 1 from Piastri on Leclerc on the first lap. Which is incredibly
phenomenal,
ballsy, right? Yeah, exactly. I haven't seen that one before. But yes, I think it was a racing incident, the Sainz-Behrman incident. But like I said, Sainz needs to stop beefing with rookies, to be honest, because it's getting a bit silly.
Yeah, Sainz is just like me for real. Let's go to our DNFs and random predictions. These will be done quickly because I don't think any of these came through, did they? Daniel, what? No, I need to go through my predictions. Forgot about that. So I said pole for Leclerc. Did not happen. I said Lando Norris wins. That did not happen. He did finish second, so that's a point. I put Leclerc in second. That didn't happen. Ferrari Hopium, it is what it is. No points there. Hamilton, I put third. Again, Ferrari Hopium, but no points. Piastri fourth, which nets me 1. And George Russell in fifth. Very anonymous, but he did finish fifth. So it's 3 points there. We'll take that every day of the week. DNFs and random predictions, like I said, though. Daniel, would you want to quickly go through this?
I predicted Leclerc would DNF from pole, which didn't happen, and I'm adding that to the list of things that I'm glad didn't come true in my predictions. And the random prediction was Aston Martin would be the last of the finishers in quali and race, which is bananas. I don't know why I put quali in there. They were together in the race at the back, but that's because Lance Stroll was in the kind of pit box for an eternity, and Alonso had a suspension failure, but still they did not finish, so it doesn't really count. And they were better in quali than I thought because their efficiency is not so bad in a straight line. So 0 points.
0 points there. Lucy, is in it the same story with you, right?
Yeah, still 0 points. I said Verstappen with DNF with this whole slightly chaotic thing. I think trying to channel the fact that pole sitter hasn't won at Monza for 6 years. So I was thinking that maybe somehow the power of Tifosi magic Italian Grand Prix stuff was going to make Verstappen DNF. I don't really know what I was thinking there, but I said he'd DNF and he didn't. He won, in case we hadn't noticed. So that was obviously wrong. I also said that Colapinto was going to get his first points. He did not. I mean, I don't think he had a particularly bad race. He was there. He didn't crash into anyone. He didn't get any penalties. So, to be honest, given he's in an Alpine, I still think that's pretty all right.
Yeah, low expectations from that Alpine. It just doesn't seem like it's got a lot. I put Behrman DNF, like Daniel mentioned at the top of the show, and I said a random prediction was a red flag, which we didn't see. But that brings us to the end of this episode for the Italian Grand Prix. We'll be back next week to preview the events of the upcoming Azerbaijan Grand Prix at the Baku Street Circuit. So stay tuned for that. I want to thank you guys very much for watching it from your seats at home, watching and listening, depending if you're on Spotify. I want to thank Lucy and Daniel for joining me on this episode, and I'll see you guys at some point in the near future. Goodbye.